Genesis chapter 37. A contrast tonight between two brothers. We get into the story of Joseph, one that I think we all know well and has been familiar to us probably since we were children. Just as many of these stories in Genesis have been familiar to us, and I hope that in this study we've been adding a bit of an extra dimension to some of those historical narratives. So tonight, as we come into chapter 37, I want to show you that we are looking at Joseph and we are looking at Judah, two of the firstborn sons of Jacob. Or rather, Judah is the fourthborn of Leah. But remember, Reuben disqualified himself. Simeon and Levi disqualified themselves back in chapters 34 and 35. And then now we're taking up, is it going to be Judah, the fourthborn, or is it going to be Joseph, the firstborn of Rachel, the beloved wife? And so let's begin here in chapter 37. Now Jacob lived in the land where his fathers had sojourned, in the land of Canaan. These are the records of the generations of Joseph, or of Jacob. Joseph, now, when 17 years of age, was pasturing the flock with his brothers while he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father. Here is the first bit that we see about Joseph. One of the commentators said that this man that God is going to use, he's about probably 17 at this time, and he comes back and he kind of tattletales on his brothers. He's kind of the spoiled, rotten, bratty kid. And God is going to, of course, use him and transform him and shape him. He brings back a bad report that has a connotation of he's telling his father all of the bad that they're doing. And now Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons. We see Jacob's family continue to be very dysfunctional because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a varicolored tunic. Now, this is an interesting word. We don't really know what the word is, and we've traditionally heard multicolored coat or coat of many colors, a varicolored tunic. That comes from the Septuagint translation, the Greek, and I think it's a good translation. The term is used elsewhere for Princess Tamar, one of David's daughters in 2 Samuel. So some have thought, well, maybe it just means a long-sleeved robe, an ornamented robe, but the idea is it's a very, very nice robe, probably indicating royalty. And so coat of many colors, multicolored coat, or even just ornamented coat, as some have put it. But he gives him this special tunic. And his brothers see the favoritism. And in verse 4, his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, and so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms. This becomes a motif throughout this chapter here, that Jacob's brothers hate him. They do not like him, and they are filled with antipathy toward him. Then Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they literally Joseph hated him. They added, Joseph means add, and so the text says they added more hate to their hatred of Joseph. They hated him all the more. And then in verse 6, he said to them, "Please listen to this dream which I have had. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf rose up and also stood erect, and behold, your sheaves gathered around, bowed down to my sheaf." And so here's Joseph coming to his brothers who hate him, and he's already been shown special favor, and now he's coming to them and he's kind of flaunting his dreams in front of them. Notice also that God never speaks in this story or in this dream. He never speaks here in this dream. This is the first dream recorded in Genesis where God does not speak to the person directly, but rather it's conveyed through symbols. And his brothers, verse 8, said to him, "Are you actually going to reign over us? Or are you really going to rule over us?" So they added even more hate to the hate that they already had to him. They hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Now he had still another dream and related it to his brothers and said, "Lo, I have had still another dream." as we'll see later on next time, when there are two dreams recorded right in a row here, it symbolizes that it's for sure and that it's going to happen. It is going to happen for sure. He said, "Lo, I have had still another dream, and behold, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me," indicative that his family was going to come and bow down. The sun being the father, Jacob, the moon being whatever maternal figure now was in his life after his mother had died, Rachel had died, and then, of course, the stars being his brothers. And he related it to his father now and to his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come to bow ourselves down before you to the ground?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. Then his brothers went to pasture their father's flock in Shechem. And Jacob is rightfully worried about his sons going to Shechem. Remember what happened in Shechem when Levi and Simeon slaughtered the people, and now they're heading back to pasture flocks there. So Jacob has a reason to worry about his sons there. I'm going through too many sets of notes here. I didn't put everything together like I usually do. Verse 13, Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send you to them." And he says, "I will go." Then he said to him, "Go now and see about the welfare of your brothers and the welfare of the flock, and bring back word to me." So he sent him to the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. Now Joseph is going to travel about 50 miles here. That's quite a journey for a young boy. And a man found him. He's just wandering in the field here. And the man asked him, "What are you looking for?" He said, "I'm looking for my brothers. Please tell me where they are pasturing the flock." And then the man said, "They have moved from here, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers, and he found them at Dothan. And here we have a providential meeting with this Canaanite man in this field. And he's sending Joseph now to his brothers. He just happened to overhear the brothers say that they were going to go to this place. And now he relates this to Joseph and sends Joseph on his way. And Joseph's going to get there just in time for the very dramatic parts of this episode. So the man sends him away to Dothan. Verse 18, when they saw him from a distance, before he came close to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer." Literally, the Hebrew reads, "Here comes this master of dreams. Now then, come and let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits, and we will say, 'A wild beast devoured him.' Then let us see what will become of his dreams." But Reuben heard this and rescued him out of their hands and said, "Let us not take his life." Remember, Reuben is the firstborn. So here he's acting in place of his father, trying to protect the boy. And Reuben further said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit that is in the wilderness, but do not lay hands on him, that he might rescue him out of their hands to restore him to his father." So it came about when Joseph reached his brothers that they stripped Joseph of the tunic, the varicolored tunic that was on him, and they took him and threw him into the pit. Now, the pit, it's literally a cistern. And there are many cisterns in Israel. They're large bottle-shaped pits that are hewn out of rock to retain water. And typically they range between 6 and 20 feet in depth. And so here a dry one is going to make an excellent dungeon. And he goes to some links here to show us that the pit was empty without any water in it. So Joseph, number one, isn't going to drown, but he's also not going to get any water, so he's not going to last in that pit for very long. Now, they sat down to eat a meal. Can you imagine? You throw your brother in a pit, you're planning to kill him or do something odd with him, and you just sit down to eat a meal. Well, this is the state of his brothers. They sit down and they eat a meal. They're not distressed about what they're doing. And as they raised their eyes and they looked, behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead with their camels bearing aromatic gum and balm and myrrh on their way to bring them down to Egypt. They're probably crossing through Israel from east to west, heading towards the Dead Sea, and from there, Or that's the Mediterranean Sea, I'm sorry. And then from there, they're going to get on what's known as the King's Highway, and they're going to travel that highway down to Egypt. And by the way, it's a caravan. Because of robbers and thieves along the way, most sellers, most traders of goods did not travel alone. They traveled in groups, and this would be a huge group with lots of donkeys, lots of carts, all traveling along the way to Egypt. And so they see their chance. Judah said to his brothers, What profit is it for us to kill our brother and cover up his blood? What use is it to murder him? He's our brother. He's our own flesh. Now, the irony of the next part apparently is lost on him, because he says, verse 27, Come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. So instead of Reuben, we see Judah taking the lead and the brothers listening to him. They're not listening to Reuben anymore. Ever since the incident in chapter 34 when he slept with Bilhah, Rachel's maid, it seems no longer are they listening to Reuben. So they listen to Judah. Verse 28, Then some Midianite traders passed by. Judges 8 shows us that Ishmaelites and Midianites are really the same people, just a different term for them. Some Midianite traders passed by, so they pulled him up and they lifted Joseph out of the pit, and they sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. Thus they brought Joseph into Egypt. See the providence of God and how God orchestrates things, that it just seems on a whim that they throw Joseph into a pit. And then on just another whim that they take him out of the pit and they sell him to the Ishmaelites as a slave. And it just so happens that the Ishmaelites take him and sell him as a slave in Egypt. And of course, we all know what happens next and how God puts Joseph into the positions that he puts him into. And it's all for his own divine plan, according to his purpose. But it just seems as though they're going along with life. But yet we know the providential hand of God guiding every single event here. Verse 29, Now Reuben returned to the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit. So he tore his garments. And he returned to his brothers and said, The boy is not there. As for me, where am I to go? So they took Joseph's tunic and slaughtered a male goat and dipped the tunic in the blood. And they sent the varicolored tunic and brought it to their father and said, We found this. Please examine it to see whether it is your son's tunic or not. Then he examined it and said, It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. So Jacob tore his clothes and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. Then all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, Surely I will go down to Sheol in mourning for my son. So his father wept for him. He says, I'm going to go down to the grave, mourning for my son. Such was his mourning for Joseph. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the bodyguard. His brothers probably thought that he was going to be sold into menial labor somewhere in Egypt. Well, just so happens in the providence of God that Joseph makes it into the house of the captain of the guard. He is in a very great place. He's not doing menial labor, but rather he's in this wonderful home that he's going to be put in charge of everything. Potiphar, by the way, means he that Ra, the sun god, has given. And it's going to become important sometime down the road. Just tuck that away for a few weeks or whatever. And it came about, chapter 38, at that time that Judah departed from his brothers and visited a certain Adullamite, whose name was Hira. And so Judah now departs from his brothers. In the meantime, this is sequential. It seems like it's interrupting the story of Joseph. And even in chapter 39, it seems like it just takes up the story of Joseph right where chapter 37 left off. It's sort of a strange addition here, and some people don't even want to cover it all that much. It just seems so strange about why it's tucked into this part here. But we're looking at what Judah was doing, the other contender for king, what Judah was doing during the time that Joseph was in Egypt for 20 plus years. And so now we have the account of Judah just given to us in one chapter for compare and for contrast with Joseph. And it came about at that time that Judah departed from his brothers and visited a certain Adulamite whose name was Hira. So he's going to the Canaanites. Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he took her and went into her. So she conceived and bore a son, and he named him Then she conceived again and bore a son and named him Onan. She bore still another son and named him Shelah, and it was at Chezib that she bore him. Now Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. So here we see a lot of years gapped. It just happens in quick succession. It's looking at Judah's propagation now, the family line of Judah. And there are some interesting events that happen here. Her name was Tamar, verse 7, but Judah's firstborn, was evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord took his life. Now, we're given that up front, that was evil, but it doesn't seem that Judah was quite aware of that perception, that the Lord took his life because he was evil. So Judah then says to Onan, go into your brother's wife and perform your duty as brother-in-law to her and raise up offspring to your brother. See, the worst thing that could happen is that a man die childless, that there's no one to take on the family name, that he doesn't have any sons to continue the name and to receive the inheritance. That becomes very important later on when the inheritance is the land of Israel. And so in the ancient Near East, what they would do is when a brother would die, one of the other brothers would go and take his wife and have children with her in order to raise them up in place of his brother so that the inheritance still goes to the brother. And so they do this. But it says that Onan, verse 9, knew that the offspring would not be his. So when he went into his brother's wife, he wasted his seed on the ground in order not to give offspring to his brother. So 3 brothers, right? Onan, and Shelah. And it was going to be 4 parts of an inheritance. The firstborn, would get half the inheritance, 2 parts of the inheritance, a double portion. And then the other 2 would get a quarter of it each. And so Onan realized that if he raised up offspring to his brother, he no longer gets 2/3 of the inheritance, but rather the son that he bears with Tamar is going to get half the inheritance. So he's thinking here about his own inheritance, and he's being very selfish. And it says, and whenever, multiple times, it's a verb that expresses many, many times this happens. He went into his brother's wife. He would waste his seed on the ground in order not to give offspring to his brother. But what he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, so he took his life also. And again, Judah is not aware of this. Instead, he seems to have some superstition here about Tamar. And he says, verse 11, he says to his daughter-in-law Tamar, remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up, for he thought, I am afraid that he too may die like his brothers. So Tamar went and lived in her father's house. So now she is betrothed to Shelah, however old Shelah is at this time. And when Shelah comes of age and Judah deems it acceptable to marry the 2 of them, Shelah and Tamar, then they would come together and they would produce offspring for So Tamar went and lived at her father's house. Verse 12, now after a considerable time, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died, and she remains anonymous. It doesn't really give her a name. But she dies. Judah's wife dies. And when the time of mourning was ended, Judah went up to his sheep shearers at Timnah, he and his friend Hira the Adulamite. It was told to Tamar, behold, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. So she removed her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil and wrapped herself and sat at the gateway of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah, for she saw that Shelah had grown up and she had not been given to him as a wife. So she sees that this younger brother, Shelah, has not been given to her as a wife, and that there's no intention on Judah's part to give Shelah to Tamar in order to raise up seed. And so she does what's acceptable in the ancient Near East. It's never written in Leviticus or in Deuteronomy that this was an accepted practice in Israel, but it seems in the Hittite lands and the ancient Assyrian lands, this was something that they did. So instead of going to the next brother now, she's going to the father-in-law in order to raise up children for him. But she does this deceptively. She removes her widow's garments and covers herself with a veil, wraps herself, sat in the gateway of Enaim on the road, and she's trying to look like a prostitute so that Judah will come and stop by her. And when Judah saw her, and he's probably coming away drunk and very happy at this point, and Judah sees her and thought she was a harlot, for she had covered her face. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, "Here now, let me come in to you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, "What will you give me that you may come in to me?" He said, "Therefore I will send you a young goat from the flock." She said, "Moreover, will you give me a pledge until you send it? What will you leave with me in order that I know that you will make true on your word?" And he said, "What pledge shall I give you?" And she said, "Your seal and your cord and your staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. These were all personal effects. The seal would have been something that he could have pressed into the clay in order to show that it's him sending something or approving something. And then the cord, something that identifies him. And the staff would have been personalized to him, having his name and the family symbol on it. And so he gave them to her until he would send payment to her. And then she arose and departed, removed her veil, and put on her widow's garments. When Judah, verse 20, sent the young goat by his friend the Adulamite to receive the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. He asked the men of her place, saying, "Where is the temple prostitute who is by the road at Enaim?" But they said, "There has been no temple prostitute here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I did not find her." And furthermore, the men of the place said, "There has been no temple prostitute here." Then Judah said, "Let her keep them, otherwise we will become a laughingstock. After all, I sent this young goat, but you did not find her." Now it was about 3 months later that Judah was informed, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot, and behold, she is with child by harlotry." And Judah sees his chance now. He can get her out of his house. He can get that pest away. And then Judah said, "Bring her out, let her be burned." It was while she was being brought out that she sent to her father-in-law, saying, "I am with child by the man to whom these things belong." And she said, "Please examine and see whose signet ring and cords and staff are these." Judah recognized them and said, "She is more righteous than I." What an admission. Some commentators actually say this is Judah's turning point. This is where he begins to come to the Lord and make his life right. He says that she is more righteous than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not have relations with her again. It came about at the time she was giving birth that, behold, there were twins in her womb. And this is to be reminiscent of Jacob and Esau, that there were twins in the womb. And moreover, it took place while she was giving birth, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, "This one came out first." But as it came about, as he drew back his hand, that behold, his brother came out. Then she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." So he was named Perez. So just in that little picture, in that little episode, we see what would have been the younger brother usurping the place of the older brother, just as Jacob with Esau, but here from the womb. And so Perez means breach. He made quite a breach for himself there. And it's through Perez that the Messiah is going to come. Afterward, his brother came out, who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and he was named Zerah, dawning or brightness. So why this chapter? Odd, right? It's not one that we really think about a whole lot. But here we're being shown this to contrast with what has come before already with Joseph and what's going to come later with Joseph. It's put right in the middle of this. And we get a sense also of Judah's disposition at this time. Probably about the time that he pronounces Tamar to be more righteous than he is about the time that he's going to be heading to Egypt to stand before his brother and to apologize to Joseph. And so it seems that Judah would have a lot of progress that needs to be made in order to be named the firstborn, in order to be named the line of the Messiah, through whom the kings are going to come, and through whom ultimately the king, the Messiah, is going to come. And so in chapter 39 now, contrast this with Joseph's righteousness. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph as he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Now his master saw that the Lord was with him, and how the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. Just as with all of the other patriarchs, he's seeing that Joseph is prospering, and he's seeing that his household is being made to prosper on account of the Lord's chosen ones. And how the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. Verse 4, so Joseph found favor in his sight and became his personal servant. And he made him overseer over his house, and all that he owned he put in his charge. It came about that from the time he made him overseer in his house and over all that he owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph. Thus the Lord's blessing was upon all that he owned in the house and in the field. It's total, it's complete. Verse 6, so he left everything he owned in Joseph's charge, and with him there he did not concern himself with anything except the food which he ate. It seemed that every bit of business was given into Joseph's hands. Potiphar didn't even worry himself about the affairs of his household. He just gave it all to Joseph, the trusted slave, so that he only worried about coming in and going and eating his food. Now Joseph, it says, was handsome in form and in appearance. And it came about after these events that his master's wife looked with desire at Joseph, and she said, lie with me. But he refused, and said to his master's wife, behold, with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he has put all that he owns in my charge. There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God? Now compare that with what happened with Judah before. And Joseph is not giving in. He's not going to commit this great sin against God. And he even gives that as his reason. It's against God. He's trusting God. He's showing that he is faithful to God. And this happened many, many times. Verse 10, she spoke to him day after day, and he did not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her. Now it happened one day that he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the household was there. She caught him by the garment, saying, lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand and fled and went outside. And this will cause Paul later on to say, flee from every youthful lust. Flee it. Just run away, get out of there. Now it happened, or verse 12, she caught him by the garment, saying, lie with me, left outside. Verse 13, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled outside, she called to the men of her household and said to them, see, he has brought in a Hebrew to us to make sport of us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I screamed. When he heard that I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled and went outside. In Egypt, it's hot and humid, and it probably wasn't much of a garment. Slaves probably didn't wear that much because they were busy and it was probably very hot. So she's probably not holding a lot of clothing there. So it was probably very easy for her to get off of him. But he flees it. She goes outside. Now she's lying. Now I want to show an observation that's very interesting about these 3 chapters altogether. In every single chapter, you have someone being deceived with garments. In the first chapter, in chapter 37, we saw Jacob being deceived with Joseph's garment, that Joseph was dead. In chapter 38, we see Judah being deceived with his own garments, with his steel and his staff and his the other thing, and his cord. And then we see here in chapter 39, Potiphar being deceived with Joseph's garments. It ties these three chapters together in many ways to compare and to contrast the reactions of the different people and the happenings and the circumstances. But here we find Jacob, unlike Judah, or we find Joseph, unlike Judah, to be absolutely trustworthy. He did no wrong. He was in the right. But now he's going to be punished for a crime that he never did. And again, just as before, we see the providential hand of God moving things around, guiding events, so that Joseph is ending up exactly where he wants him to be. In verse 17, she spoke to Potiphar with these words, "The Hebrew slave whom you brought to us came in to me to make sport of me, and as I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled outside." Here she's reduced to racial slurs, that Hebrew that you brought in. He tried to make sport of me. And so now verse 19, now when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spoke to him, saying, "This is what your slave did to me," his anger burned. Now, he doesn't kill Joseph, as would probably happen, but rather he just throws him in prison. And so it seems that he was probably trustworthy enough that Potiphar kind of wondered whether this was true, but any matter, he ends up in prison. Joseph's master took him and put him in jail, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the jail. But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's charge all the prisoners who were in the jail, so that whatever was done there, he was responsible for it. The chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper. Just as always with the patriarchs, again, even in jail, God is making Joseph to prosper. He is right where God wants him. He is positioned just where he should be. And God is going to providentially use these circumstances, as you know, for great good. Now, Joseph's two dreams here are followed by a journey into Egypt under bad circumstances, eventually resulting in the salvation of literally all Israel. Does that sound familiar? Quite a foreshadowing. A few thousand years later, a man named Joseph is going to flee to Egypt because of dreams in bad circumstances, and through that, God is going to providentially use it to bring about the salvation of all Israel. Fascinating foreshadowing. I just thought that was a neat tie between all of that. But we see that God's grace uses broken people. God's grace providentially uses us. And he always puts us where he wants us to be. Now, I left this for last. I didn't include this with chapter 38. But as we're closing, going back to Judah and Tamar. Very interesting. Remember, Judah went to Canaan, and he married a Canaanite woman, something that Abraham did not want for Isaac, and something that Isaac did not want for Jacob. Now, Judah goes and he marries a Canaanite woman. And so they're in danger not only of losing the line of Judah, as all of three of his sons are possibly going to die. Of course, Shelah does not die, but the first two die, so that the family line is in danger. That's why he superstitiously does not want to give Shelah to Tamar, because he thinks that she's cursed for some reason, but rather we find out that it was because God, or because and Onan were evil in the sight of the Lord. But now, Judah's line is in danger, and he is married to a Canaanite. There is a danger of assimilation into the land of Canaan then. very interesting. And going Tamar and deceiving Judah and having a child with Judah totally counteracts that. Tamar is not a Canaanite name. We're not told her lineage, but it's not a Canaanite name. It's a Hebrew name. Quite possibly another offspring from Abraham. And so totally overlooks Judah's Canaanite, half Canaanite sons. And now Judah has an offspring that is fully Abraham's seed, fully Jewish. And so now through that line is going to come the Messiah. And so God, providentially, even in the little things, even in those chapters that sometimes we read a couple times and we just kind of go, okay, and we move on, there are some pretty amazing things going on in them. So here God is preserving the family line of Israel, and he's getting ready to do something absolutely amazing in these next couple of chapters as he is preparing the salvation of the house of Israel, which is going to become 70 people by the end of the book, all to come into the land of Egypt, to not be assimilated into Canaan, but also to wait out the time for the iniquity of the Canaanite to be complete, just as God told Abraham. And then through Judah and through his offspring are going to come the Messiah, who one day is going, or who would one day, is in the past for us, in the future for them, who would one day save his people from their sins, just as it was prophesied to Joseph and to Mary when they had the Messiah. And so here we see God's plan of redemption. It's all providentially guided by his hand throughout time. And he knows what he's doing, even when to us it seems as though he doesn't. He has us in his hand, and he will bring us to glory. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for these 3 chapters that we might overlook sometimes. Help us, Lord, to see your providential hand. Help us to know that you are watching over us, just as you watched over Joseph, just as even you guided the events with Judah and Tamar. Lord, thank you for the Messiah who came. Thank you for his death on the cross, that he has reconciled us to you. Lord, be blessed forever. In Jesus' name, amen.